welcome to this little Bible study on John chapter 10. We're going to be looking at the next section from John chapter 10 today. And this is the fourth of the I am sayings, the Good Shepherd, one that we know well, one that we've heard a few times, and one that we can also reconnect with and understand. And what we want to do today is to look at what does it mean? What does the I am saying of I'm the Good Shepherd actually mean for us? And we're going to follow on in the process that we were looking at last week, where we're linking these I am sayings together, where this one now the fourth link in that chain of 7 I am sayings. So let's listen together again as we read the passage together in John. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheepfold. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, "He is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him?" But others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" In this first section, what I want to do is for us to just explore this story a bit more, to explore the concepts of what it was like to be a shepherd, to get a little bit of a background, a little bit of a context. So let me give you some context, a little bit about shepherds. As you'll see in the picture behind me, the shepherd walked in front of the sheep. And look, that wasn't maybe always the case, but that's the image that is being given here in terms of the concepts of what Jesus does, is that he walks in front of the sheep, that the sheep hear his voice and then follow him. And so there's that sense, instead of pushing the sheep, instead of goading them, instead of moving them where they don't want to go, it's more a case of trusting the shepherd, that the shepherd will take them where they need to be and where the connections are. Now we're going to explore that a bit more later on in the session when we look at this, the I am saying of the Good Shepherd and what that actually can mean for us. So what do we do with this? Where do we go with the context? So the context is also about shepherds in general. Now, today, if we think of, especially here in Australia, if we think of jackaroos or jillaroos, if we think of those people who are working with as shepherds or whatever, we think of them kind of as lower on the socio-economic scale or connections within the country. And sometimes we apply that to Israel at this period of time as well. Well, I don't think that's appropriate. Because in fact, the shepherds were really the bankers of the time. Remember that people didn't have lots of actual cash money. What they had were their flocks and their herds. That's where their wealth was. And so you can imagine that to entrust your flocks and your herds to somebody would actually be giving them a fair amount of authority, would be giving them a fair amount of responsibility, because that's where your wealth was. Remember that, in fact, the most famous of all the shepherds in the Bible is, of course, David himself. Remember, it was David who penned Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." Of course, when Samuel came to anoint him as the new king of Israel, that he was looking after his father's flocks. So you need to see that the concept of the shepherd is not that somehow they're the lowest end of the society. Sometimes people have said that in terms of, for example, with Jesus, when Jesus' birth came along, that the angels came to the shepherds, and that, of course, the angels were coming to the low end of the society. Again, I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. In fact, what that story was about was rather that the angels came and heralded the coming of the good shepherd. And who better to come then to would be to actual shepherds who were doing that work at the time. So let's understand that the shepherds were not what we would think of today as being just at the bottom end of the society, or in fact as an unskilled laborer. These were people who were put into responsibility for the looking after of the wealth of those families and those people, and they were connected with it. Now, if we think of it that way, if we think of the shepherd as the one who looks after the sheep, who cares for the sheep, who looks after the wealth of those people, who walks in front of the sheep, I'd like you to reflect on the passage. Think about the passage just as it is. What's your first impressions? What do you get out of the passage? What are some of the interesting things that jump out at you for the passage? What are maybe the things that you don't understand or don't connect with? But have a look at the passage and just reflect on it for a little while, and then share those reflections with each other. Welcome back. This is the fourth of the I am sayings. Now, if you remember, we've got the 4 I am sayings. Number 1, I'm the bread of life. Number 2, I am the light of the world. Number 3, which we had just previously in this same chapter, I am the gate. And now we have the 4th in that little series of 7, I am the good shepherd. Now, remember what I was saying last time, is that I see that these 7 I am sayings are not 7 individual or separated aspects of Jesus' life. And so often we've seen it that way. We've seen them as different aspects or different facets of who Jesus is. Instead, what I want to see them as really a chain of discipleship, of saying, how do we grow as disciples? What does discipleship actually mean? Remembering that John wrote his gospel so that it would be, in a sense, a manual for us for discipleship. I'm the bread of life. It's where we get our sustenance from. We eat, we feed on the word of God, we feed on Christ, and through that we get energized to go and start the process of discipleship. Without that, discipleship dies. Without that, we don't have the energy to do it. He's the light of the world. As we receive him, so we then shine out. Remember that discipleship is never about just growing our brains. It's not about growing our knowledge. Discipleship is about actually how do we put into practice that which we are receiving. True maturity in Christ is not how much you know, but rather how much we are able to put into practice. Then comes the gate. That the gate is the thing that allows us to come into the sheepfold, so into the place of learning, of growing, of maturing, of safety. But the gate swings both ways. It also allows the sheep to go out into the pasture. And as I was saying last time, the pasture for us is the world that we go out and we put our Christian faith into practice into. I mean, a Christian faith that isn't put into practice has no value, because essentially that means that all that we're doing is we're going out in the world and doing what we would have done anyway. The whole point is that we would go out into the world and do differently. So in order to do that, though, we need guidance. And that's where the good shepherd comes in. The image of the good shepherd for me is so important, because what it tells us is that he goes before us. So when we go into the pasture, when we as Christians are called to be his disciples and to go out into the world to go and share him, that in fact, he goes before us. So whoever you talk to about Christ, however you share Christ with others, Jesus is already there. He's already led us into that place. So we don't have to try and find the opportunities. We don't have to try and somehow muscle our way into the conversation with Christ. The truth of it is that he is already there. Now, the theme of this particular series today this particular Bible study today is going to be on the theme of evangelism, and we'll talk about that in the next section. But what I want you to understand is that I am saying he is the good shepherd. One of the first links is that he walks in front of the sheep. So whatever situation we're walking into as we go into the pasture, whether it be something which we don't know how to face or something we don't know how to face, whether it be meeting a stranger or sitting at the bedside of someone who's ill, or embracing and holding on to somebody who's crying and is grief-stricken, whatever situation we may find, even it might be just the checkout person at your local supermarket, whatever we do where we are seeking to share faith with others, Christ is already there. I'd like you to reflect on that. That if Christ goes before us into the pasture, if Christ is the one who's there in every conversation that we're going to have, if Christ is the one who guides us and leads us, what are the areas and the connections that you have at the moment where you need guidance, where you need a sense of God's presence? And how does that make you feel that in fact the Good Shepherd goes before us? Discuss that with each other. In our second last session today, I want to talk about some of the concepts, some of the symbols that John gives us. Now remember that John doesn't give you information that you don't need. All the information that John's going to give you in a passage like this is important. And maybe we don't always understand what the passage means. We don't always understand what the symbols refer to. But I'd like you to think about some of those. Now, there's a couple which are a little complicated and a little tricky for us to understand. So, for example, there's the story of the other sheepfold. Now, what's the other sheepfold? I mean, it's all well and good to talk about Jesus's sheepfold, but what's the other sheepfold that's going to come together and have one God and one shepherd? What it could be is the Gentiles. And you need to understand that one of the themes for John is that Jesus doesn't just come to save the Jews. He comes to save all of humanity, that all of humanity can be drawn together as a flock, having one flock and one shepherd, which is Jesus himself. I think for me, that's the wonderful explanation of that other sheepfold. The sheepfold that is able to say that regardless of who you are, where you come from, what your cultural background is, that effectively we can have one shepherd in Jesus Christ. And that therefore, in fact, when we go out to share Christ with others, we can do so with all people. It doesn't have to be from our cultural framework or our particular theological understanding. But in fact, we can have one sheepfold. Yes, we may meet in different churches, but we all connect together regardless of who we are. So that's the other sheepfold. The other one is the concept of the laying down his life for the sheep. There's no doubt at all that that symbol connects later on to the end of the gospel, where Jesus talks about, where we see Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection. And of course, we see it in this story where he gives up his life willingly. He volunteers his life for the sheep, but then he also takes it up again. So again, it's looking forward, saying that yes, Christ is going to die on the cross, but that's not the end of the story. There's also the resurrection. What I'd like you to do in this section then is to look at that. In fact, there's one more. There's one more that I'd like to talk about, and that's the hired hands. The hired hands. Who are the hired hands? Now remember that in this section, really Jesus is talking about the Pharisees. He's talking about the religious leaders of their time. And one of the things that I think need to hold on to here very carefully is that maybe he's being a little judgmental about them, saying that they don't really love their people as family. They don't love their people that in a sense of owning the sheep, of actually loving the sheep, but rather they're doing the job. They're doing a job. And this is the job of looking after those sheep. It's the job of saying, well, I have to do this. My father did it, and so I'll do it as well. And what I think John's getting here is the concept of duty. That when we go out of the sheepfold, when we go out of our safety of our church out into the world, so often Christians feel that it's their duty to go and share Christ with others. You know, that somehow those people out there, oh, they need to hear about Jesus. The problem with that is that when we are hired hands, this story wants to say that the hired hands don't really love the sheep. And so when it gets difficult, when the wolves come, when the situation is difficult, they're gone. Instead, that what we need to do, the reason why we go and share Christ with others, the reason why we live out our discipleship with others, is not because we feel we should, but in fact because we feel compelled to, because we love them. And you know, I think that when we start discipleship, when we start evangelism in the attitude of wanting to love rather than wanting to convert or to change, I think it changes the way we do discipleship. We start actually treating people like human beings with a name and a history and a story, rather than to treat them like a notch on your belt, saying, I've led another one to the Lord. I've saved them from the fires of hell. Now, that might be true. But I think that this passage wants to say that we don't need to be hired hands. We actually need to be brothers and sisters in Christ. I'd like you to reflect on that, to think about what those different images mean, to think about what those images mean in your life and the way in which they can be connected. Welcome back. I want to finish this time together by talking about that big word, evangelism. Evangelism. Because I think that essentially that's what this passage and the passages that are going to come in terms of the I am sayings are really about. Is about what is evangelism really about. The word evangelism essentially comes from the Greek word, which means good news. And it's essentially, this passage wants to tell us about the good shepherd who wants us to be good news. When we get to the next I am saying, we'll find out what that good news actually is. But in order to prepare ourselves to be good news, I think we need to understand some of the elements that this passage wants to tell us. Now, number one is that the good shepherd is known by his sheep. Now, that means that the good shepherd has spent time with them. That means the good shepherd gets to know them. It means that the good shepherd actually cares for them and loves them. If we're going to do evangelism, that's our number one priority. You can't evangelize if you don't love. People won't listen to you if they don't know you. And they'll only know you if you spend time with them, not trying to convert them, but trying to get to know them. Secondly, it's sacrificial. In order to evangelize, there's a reality of sacrifice to it. And notice we see the sacrifice here, where it talks about Jesus giving up his life in order that others may come to know him. If we're going to be evangelists, if we're going to, and in fact, one thing I need to say to you is that being an evangelist is not an optional extra to discipleship. It's really the core of discipleship. That becoming disciples is about sharing Christ. That's sacrificial, because that sometimes will mean that we have to give up time, that we have to give up energy, that we have to give up some of the things that we do instead to actually spend time with those others in order to share with them. And thirdly, notice it's the command of God. That what Jesus is doing is he's living out the command that God gave him to do. This is the command to us. The command to us is not to say, well, keep your faith under wraps, as so often we have in our society. In fact, what this passage is saying is that to share your faith with others is absolutely the command that God has given us. So, if we're going to start thinking about becoming evangelists, we need to prepare ourselves for what that means. And essentially, it means that we need to be known, that we need to be sacrificial, and we need to acknowledge that this is actually the command of God to us. I'd like you to share then, what are some of the things that you find hard in sharing faith? What's the stumbling blocks for you to be able to go and share faith in an authentic way? Acknowledging those three things that this passage would want to tell us about, but also reminding ourselves that in fact, one of the things that we don't know is how to do it. And that's why the Good Shepherd is so important, because he goes before us to lead us and to guide us and to encourage us.